Welcome to this explainer. Sometimes history hinges on absolute chaos. Today, we're diving straight into how a massive geopolitical disruption, triggered by none other than Napoleon Bonaparte himself, created this incredibly unpredictable power vacuum in Egypt. It was literally the perfect storm that set the stage for the founder of modern Egypt. We are talking about a wildly volatile era where established empires collided, centuries-old systems shattered overnight, and one totally unlikely outsider managed to rise to the very top. Let's get right into it. To really wrap our heads around this epic clash, we're pulling our insights directly from a brilliant historical analysis by Shafiq Gorbal called Muhammad Ali the Great. Gorbal provides just incredible detail on the actual mechanics of this era. I absolutely love this source text because it doesn't just list off dates and battles, it breaks down exactly why the established order collapsed so spectacularly, leaving the door wide open. Okay, to start off, we really have to ask ourselves this fascinating, almost mind-boggling question. How on earth did a tobacco merchant reach the throne of Egypt? It almost sounds like a movie plot, right? We've got this unexpected hero whose incredibly humble origins stand in stark contrast to his monumental destiny as a ruler who essentially rewired the Middle East. Let's look at where it all actually began.
Part 1. The Orphan of Kavala. An Unlikely Beginning.
So picture this, it's 1769 and Muhammad Ali is born way outside of Egypt in the small coastal Balkan town of Kavala. He's orphaned young, which means he wasn't growing up in some sheltered royal court. No way. He was thrust right into the real world, taken in by the city governor. Sure, he learned horseback riding and weaponry from his dad's background in the guard, but his most valuable education came from the harsh, everyday grind of tax collection and working as a successful tobacco merchant. This rough-and-tumble, totally practical upbringing gave him something a formal education just couldn't: razor-sharp street smarts. He basically learned how to read people, manage money ruthlessly, and navigate power dynamics from the absolute ground up. Moving on to our second part, the catalyst. Bonaparte shatters the status quo. Flash forward to 1798, Napoleon Bonaparte shows up, and the centuries-old Mamluk system in Egypt just collapses, with shocking speed. This was a massive, violent clash of two completely different realities. On one side, you have the Mamluks. They were essentially this medieval cavalry, totally isolated from modern advancements, ruling through heavy taxes and traditional sword fighting. And then they charge headfirst into the French expedition. The French didn't just bring highly calculated military science, they brought seismic administrative shifts, hospitals, and a super strict, centralized rule. The Mamluks didn't just lose a battle, their entire societal framework was dismantled basically overnight. Now, the crazy part is the French occupation was actually super short. They were there for just over 3 years before getting kicked out by Ottoman and British forces. But the damage? Totally irreversible. When the French left, the country didn't just snap back to normal. The Mamluks were crippled. The Ottomans were desperate to regain control, and essentially the starting gun went off for a vicious, all-out political free-for-all. Which brings us to part 3, the power vacuum, a state of total chaos. Look at this timeline. Between 1801 and 1805, Egypt went through this highly condensed, insanely volatile window. The place was virtually ungovernable. You've got foreign armies retreating, local warlords carving up territory, and everyday civilians just caught in the brutal crossfire. It was the kind of chaotic environment that would destroy most ordinary people. But, as we'll see, it was the absolute perfect ladder for someone who knew exactly how to navigate the madness. To really grasp how dysfunctional things were, just look at the rap sheet of the official Ottoman governors who were sent in to fix things. It's almost comical how badly this went. Khosrow Pasha couldn't pay his troops, boom, overthrown by mutiny. Tahir Pasha showed massive favoritism and was assassinated in mere weeks. Ali Pasha literally walked straight into a Mamluk trap and was killed. And then there's Khurshid Pasha, who just resorted to outright extortion, using oppressive mercenaries that completely alienated the public. Every single one of them failed because they had no money, no loyal troops, and no way to crush the surviving Mamluks. Part 4. Mastering the Chaos, the Strategy of Muhammad Ali. So, while all these official governors are falling like dominoes, Muhammad Ali is just quietly watching. As a commander of the Albanian forces, he was in the perfect spot to exploit all this turmoil. And notice what he does here. He doesn't just make some blind, egotistical grab for power. First, he stays completely aloof. He literally lets his rivals bleed each other dry. Then, he forms these incredibly pragmatic, temporary alliances, even teaming up with his sworn enemies, the Mamluks, to kick out the Ottoman governors. Once that's done, he totally flips the script, teaming up with his Albanian troops to isolate those very same Mamluks. But his absolute masterstroke? He played the populist. He aligned with highly respected religious leaders to protect regular Egyptians from the crushing taxes everyone else was imposing. I mean, he read the room better than an entire global empire could.
And that leads us to part 5, the climactic moment, May 1805.
By May of 1805, Cairo is at a total boiling point. The public is just exhausted. The looting, the taxes, the endless street fighting, they'd had enough. So they take matters into their own hands. The leaders of the Egyptian public, Syed Omar Makram and Sheikh al-Sharqawi, march directly up to Muhammad Ali and deliver this incredible quote: "We will not accept anyone but you as our governor." Talk about a payoff. He didn't even have to conquer the city by force. The local notables were so desperate for stability that they literally bypassed the Sultan in Istanbul and handed the keys to the country right to him. Which leaves us with this really profound final thought to chew on. How does an orphaned tobacco merchant from Kavala step into the explosive, messy void left by Napoleon Bonaparte and walk out as the founder of a modern state? He outsmarted medieval warlords, he outmaneuvered a massive global empire, and he completely weaponized the desperation of the public. It is a sheer masterclass in strategy. But it really makes you wonder, once a guy wins a country through that much cunning manipulation, what on earth does he do when it's finally time to actually rule it? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I hope it gave you a totally new perspective on the rise of Muhammad Ali Pasha.
Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into a literal masterclass in political patience, cunning, and the raw mechanics of seizing power. If you've ever found yourself wondering exactly how modern states are forged out of the ashes of absolute chaos and how certain leaders manage to orchestrate their rise right to the very top, well, you're in the perfect place. We're going to look at the strategies, the maneuvers, and the ultimate price of absolute control.
So think about this for a second. How do you conquer an entire country without actually starting a war? It sounds impossible, right? Today, we are looking at the paradox of an obscure Albanian mercenary who managed to master the violent, totally unpredictable chaos of early 19th century Egypt to become its undisputed, modernizing ruler. It's an unbelievable story of watching, waiting, and striking at exactly the right moment.
Part 1, Power Struggle, after the French. To really understand how he pulled this off, we have to set the stage. When Napoleon's French forces packed up and departed in 1801, they didn't exactly leave behind a stable, functioning government. No, they left a massive power vacuum that plunged Egypt into absolute, terrifying instability.
It was basically a rapid revolving door of rulers. Just look at how fast this moves. 1801, the French forces depart. Fast forward to 1803, the Ottoman-appointed ruler, Khosrow Pasha, gets overthrown by his own unpaid troops. By 1804, rival Mamluk warlords, specifically El Bardisi and El Alfi, are ruthlessly battling each other for control of Cairo and the provinces. And by 1805, we're looking at unprecedented political chaos. Mamluk and Ottoman factions were literally tearing the country apart just to claim the throne.
Our historical insights today are drawn straight from the text Muhammad Ali the Great by Shafiq Gorbal. And the book paints a really grim picture here. The Egyptian populace was completely exhausted during this period. These were just regular, everyday people caught in the crossfire, getting absolutely crushed by heavy taxes, forced labor, and constant looting by these warring factions. They desperately needed a savior.
Section 2. Muhammad Ali's political cunning. Now this is where it gets really interesting, because our protagonist strategically flips the whole script. While everyone else is just wildly swinging at each other, he acts as this quiet, brilliant observer, rather than just another brute force conqueror.
You see, the old guard, the Mamluks and Ottomans, relied entirely on brute force, heavy taxation, and constant destructive infighting. They completely alienated the very people they were trying to rule. But Muhammad Ali, he relied on extreme patience, calculated observation, brilliant modern public relations tactics, and a feigned neutrality. Honestly, he was playing chess while everyone else was literally fighting in the mud.
Just look at his Machiavellian playbook. First, he totally withholds his own ambitions. He just steps back and lets the Ottoman governor Khosrow Pasha fail financially. Then, he actually allows his own Albanian military factions to riot and demand pay, which cranks up the pressure. He lets Mamluk leaders like El Bardisi heavily tax and enrage the public. And throughout all of this, he maintains a separate, completely unblemished stance. He essentially just let his enemies do the heavy lifting of tearing each other down for him. Part 3. The popular will chooses. Let's see how all of this masterminding builds to a pivotal turning point in May 1805, when the Egyptian people finally hit their absolute breaking point.
On May 13, 1805, respected Egyptian popular leaders, scholars, and elites, guys like Sheikh el-Sharqawi and el-Sayed Omar Makram, took unprecedented action. They totally bypassed the traditional Ottoman rulers. The result? They offered Muhammad Ali the police, the official robe of power. These popular leaders essentially mandated him to rule, laying down strict conditions for justice and fairness.
They told him unequivocally, "We accept none but you as our ruler." Think about how crazy that is. The people, led by their scholars, practically forced the throne into his hands. He was able to bypass the Ottoman Empire's traditional authority entirely, all because the people of Egypt chose him as their champion to end the chaos. But as history constantly shows us, gaining power is very different from keeping it. Once he was actually in charge, Muhammad Ali realized that maintaining control required a drastic shift. He had to transition from being this populist leader of the masses into a ruthless, absolute monarch. To build the modern state he was envisioning, he couldn't share power, especially not with the old warlords.
Which brings us to part 4, the Citadel Massacre and the end of the Mamluks. We are now looking at the shocking, blood-soaked climax of his consolidation of power in the year 1811.
Muhammad Ali came to a really grim realization. The old guard, those deeply entrenched Mamluk warlords who had essentially run Egypt for centuries, and even the rebellious Albanian military factions, they all had to be completely eradicated to stabilize the country. He knew, for a fact, his modern, centralized state could never exist alongside the constant threat of these independent warlords.
So, let's break down exactly how a mastermind operates with cold, calculated ruthlessness. Step 1. He organizes a grand military expedition to Arabia. Step 2. Under that pretense, he invites all the Mamluk leaders up to the citadel in Cairo for this lavish farewell ceremony. Step 3. Once they are deep inside the narrow rock passages, he traps them behind the massive gates. Step 4. His troops eliminate the opposition entirely. It was a swift, total eradication.
Now, there is a profound, almost wild irony noted in our source text. The author points out, he was a man who hated massacres and abhorred violence, yet he took on the responsibility of others to end the chaos. He personally despised bloodshed, yet he went ahead and orchestrated one of the most horrific massacres in history just to permanently end the systemic violence of the Mamluks that had plagued Egypt for generations.
And honestly, this brilliantly illustrates the ultimate historical paradox of his reign. Muhammad Ali absolutely built modern Egypt, but he built it on a foundation of absolute ruthless authority. Achieving that unprecedented modernization, building armies, establishing schools, creating major infrastructure, it was all only made possible through his unquestioned control of the entire nation.
So I want to end today by leaving you with this provocative thought to ponder. Was this bloodshed truly the only way to break that centuries-old cycle of chaos and build a modern state? Could Egypt have moved forward without the sheer brutality of the Citadel Massacre? It's a tough question, but it really lays bare the true, often brutal mechanics of state building and power. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer.
Okay, let's jump right into this explainer, where we're going to explore how Muhammad Ali Pasha took Egypt, which was, frankly, a fractured, chaotic province at the time, and transformed it into a centralized, modern powerhouse. I mean, think about what it actually takes to build a highly functional state practically from scratch. It takes vision, sure, but more than that, it requires a well-oiled machine. And today, we're going to look at the 3 interdependent gears that made up his machine: iron, wealth, and knowledge.
Now, there is a really fascinating insight here from the author. Muhammad Ali saw Egypt as much more than just a piece of territory to rule over. He saw it as the engine to revive a struggling empire. You see, when he arrived, the broader Ottoman world was facing some really severe threats from European powers, not to mention internal decay. He didn't just want to be another local governor. He wanted to create a resilient, modern base of power that could literally stand toe-to-toe with the rapidly industrializing West.
Drawing directly from chapters 5 and 6 of Shafiq Gorbel's definitive text, Muhammad Ali the Great, we are going to unpack the mechanics behind this massive historical paradigm shift. Gorbel lays out exactly how this transformation wasn't just some stroke of luck. It was a highly calculated, sometimes ruthless, and deeply methodical process.
So here's our roadmap for today. We'll start with building a modern state,
dive into knowledge and creating the elite, explore wealth through agriculture and industry, look at iron and the national army, and finally, wrap up with the legacy of the project.
First up, building a modern state, moving from chaos to absolute centralization.
To really appreciate his achievements, we first have to understand the utter chaos of the system he completely upended. Before Muhammad Ali, Egypt was essentially run by competing factions. We're talking about the Mamluks and these independent tax farmers who basically treated their local regions like personal piggy banks. He systematically dismantled those old localized power structures. Muhammad Ali knew, for a fact, that a modern state simply cannot exist if its power is fragmented. He needed absolute centralized authority. Every single resource and every ounce of power had to flow directly back to the central government. Without that first crucial step, the rest of his machine never even gets built.
Which brings us to our second section, knowledge, creating the elite, the true engineers of the state.
Let's look at how he engineered this brand new administrative and military leadership class. Because to run a centralized state, you need highly capable people whose absolute loyalty is to that state. He referred to this elite group as Al-Safwa. And the most crucial point here is that he gathered this Al-Safwa from incredibly diverse backgrounds. He didn't just rely on one tribe or one social class. By pulling in Mamluk youth, recruits from Sudan, immigrants from Europe and the Ottoman Empire, right alongside native Egyptians, he shattered traditional tribal molds. By raising and educating them together under the umbrella of the government, he ensured their loyalty was to the state alone, not to some local warlord or ethnic faction.
This really brilliantly illustrates his methodical approach. He was fully aware of the massive knowledge gap between Egypt and Europe, so he tackled it from 3 angles at once. First, he sent educational missions of bright young students directly to places like Paris to learn European administration and science firsthand. Second, rather than just relying on foreign institutions, he built specialized local academies right back in Egypt. And third, he sponsored huge efforts to translate Western sciences into languages his people could actually understand. He was literally importing the blueprint for modernity.
Moving on to our third section, wealth, agriculture and industry monopolies, the fuel for the state.
While knowledge provided the software of the state, so to speak, Muhammad Ali knew that to fuel this vast physical machine, he desperately needed our second pillar, wealth. And it is a stark contrast. The old system was stagnant, fragmented, and controlled by the Multazim, corrupt tax farmers who squeezed the peasantry dry and kept the profits for themselves. But his new system, he abolished the Multazim entirely. In its place, he instituted a massive state monopoly, known as al-Ishtikar, taking direct control over all production and trade. Practically overnight, the state became the sole landlord, the sole merchant, and the sole exporter.
By taking that direct control of the land, he could dictate exactly what got planted. And what did he choose? Highly lucrative export crops, most notably the famous Egyptian long-staple cotton. To support this massive agricultural pivot, he completely overhauled the infrastructure. He ordered the digging of large-scale, deep irrigation canals to make sure water reached the crops year-round. He essentially turned Egyptian agriculture from a localized survival mechanism into this massive, highly profitable state-funding engine.
But he definitely didn't stop at farming. What do you actually do with all that newly centralized wealth? Well, he funneled those unprecedented profits straight into kickstarting state-run industries. He bought modern machinery, established factories, and perhaps most impressively of all, he funded the construction of a powerful, modern naval fleet right in the shipyards of Alexandria. This wealth was finally giving Egypt a physical, formidable presence that it hadn't enjoyed in centuries.
That leads us directly to Section 4, iron, the modern national army, the machinery of power.
All of this immense wealth and that newly trained elite were specifically generated to fund and manage the final protective machinery of the modern state. But he faced a massive dilemma, one that had plagued previous rulers in Egypt and all across the Ottoman world. For centuries, military power had relied on rebellious, unpredictable mercenary bands, kind of like the Albanian irregulars he himself originally arrived with. So how could he possibly secure his ambitious, long-term state-building project if his army might mutiny the second they weren't paid or just decide to seize power for themselves?
His revolutionary, though undeniably harsh, answer was general conscription, or al-Tajnid al-Am. This was a truly radical shift. Instead of importing foreign mercenaries, he shifted the military burden directly onto the native Egyptian peasantry. By drafting the local population, he forged a massive, disciplined national army. Now, it was a grueling, incredibly difficult transition for the people, for sure.
but it gave the state a reliable, uniform military force that simply didn't exist before.
Of course, an army of conscripted peasants needs leaders. To lead these new troops, he connected our first pillar, knowledge, with our third pillar, iron. He established dedicated military academies right in Egypt. He utilized European expertise, literally hiring foreign officers, to train his newly formed, diverse elite into a highly professional, modern Egyptian officer corps. These guys weren't just warriors anymore. They were highly trained tacticians and engineers.
Finally, let's look at Section 5, the legacy of the modern project and its enduring impact.
So, we've seen all these gears turning perfectly together. Knowledge organized the wealth, wealth funded the iron, and iron protected the state. It naturally begs the ultimate question: did this relentless drive to centralize and modernize actually achieve its grandest imperial goals? Did he successfully resurrect the Ottoman world and create an unstoppable global power?
Well, the answer is actually quite nuanced. While international forces, namely the European powers who were terrified of his growing strength, eventually stepped in and curtailed his wider military and imperial ambitions, the project itself wasn't a total failure. Far from it, actually. His tripartite engine of iron, wealth, and knowledge exacted a heavy toll in terms of human labor and sacrifice, absolutely, but it permanently forged the bedrock of the modern Egyptian state. He took a fragmented, stagnant province and transformed it into a centralized, modern entity with its own army, its own economy, and its own educated elite. And it leaves us with a really fascinating thought to ponder. Can true modernization ever actually happen without immense centralized force, and what is the ultimate price a nation pays to step onto the modern world stage? Thank you for joining me on this explainer, and I'll catch you in the next one.
Welcome to This Explainer. Today we're diving into a literal geopolitical chess match. We're tracking the incredible rise of Muhammad Ali. And just to be totally clear right up front, we are talking about the 19th century ruler of Egypt here, definitely not the boxer. This is the fascinating story of how one insanely ambitious guy started out as a loyal Ottoman servant, played the world's biggest empires against each other, and practically single-handedly drew the borders of the modern Middle East. The sheer scale and, honestly, the rapid succession of his military campaigns are just breathtaking. I mean, over the span of just a few decades, we jump from regional border skirmishes in the 1810s straight into a major European theater in Greece, surviving a catastrophic naval disaster, then entirely pivoting to invade the Ottoman Empire itself, before finally forcing a totally terrified European coalition to step in and stop him by 1840. So, to make sense of this massive arc of ambition, we're going to break his journey down into 5 distinct phases: the Hijaz and Sudan Wars, the Maria War in Greece, the Navarino naval disaster, his direct clash with the Sultan, and finally, the 1840 Treaty of London. Okay, let's get right into it.
Phase 1. The Hijaz and Sudan Wars. This is where he tests his military might. Starting out, Muhammad Ali is basically playing the role of the indispensable loyal servant. The Ottoman Sultan had a major problem on his hands with the Wahhabi uprising, so Ali dispatched his sons, Ibrahim and Ismail, to go crush it. But here's the thing. Ali wasn't just doing his boss a solid. He was out there securing the Red Sea, gathering vital intelligence on European interests, and tapping into fresh economic resources. Most importantly, he was using these really rugged, difficult environments as a massive testing ground to sharpen his brand new, modernized military machine. But, all this regional success brings up a pretty pivotal question. Securing the Red Sea is great and all, but how does a provincial ruler suddenly step off the local map and onto the fiercely competitive global stage? Like, how do you actually force Europe to pay attention to you? Which brings us to Phase 2, the Maria War in Greece. A golden opportunity? Now, historical source material, like the deeply detailed text published by Hindawi, gives us a really fascinating perspective on this era. When a massive crisis erupted in the Morea, which is the Peloponnese Peninsula in Greece, the Sultan urgently requested help. But Muhammad Ali didn't view this as just some imperial duty. No, for him, this was a golden entry ticket. This was his chance to deploy his modern army and prove to the European superpowers that he absolutely deserved a seat at the big table. What's super interesting here is how the historical texts detail the conduct of Muhammad Ali's son, Ibrahim Pasha. See, European narratives at the time painted this Ottoman-Egyptian intervention as just a wild, indiscriminate massacre. But the impartial records actually show Ibrahim acting as a calculating, thoroughly modern general. He strictly separated combatants from civilians. He went out of his way to protect agricultural fields, and he secured commercial shipping routes. He wasn't some reckless warlord. He was highly strategic. Phase 3. The Navarino naval disaster. the momentum comes to a devastating halt. So, fearing the total collapse of the Greek rebellion, the major European powers, we're talking Britain, France, and Russia, decided they had to step in. And in October 1827, their combined Allied fleets literally trapped the Ottoman Egyptian navy in the Bay of Navarino. The result was absolute annihilation. Muhammad Ali's prized modern fleet was sent straight to the bottom of the ocean. And this right here, this is the ultimate turning point of his entire career. Before Navarino, Ali operated safely under the Sultan's umbrella, but with his fleet totally gone and his army stranded, he realized the Sultan couldn't, or maybe wouldn't, save them. So to evacuate his men, Ali bypassed his sovereign entirely. He negotiated directly with European officers. The illusion of Ottoman protection was completely shattered. From that moment on, he knew he was on his own. Phase 4, the direct clash with the Sultan. Time to demand compensation.
Having lost his fleet fighting for the Sultan's cause, he demanded the Levant as compensation. When the Sultan denied him, Ibrahim Pasha launched an absolutely lightning-fast campaign against his former master. Starting in late 1831, Egyptian forces just swept northward. They took Acre, marched straight into Damascus, crushed the resistance at Homs, pushed through the Bailan Pass, and by December 1832, they had completely annihilated the main Ottoman army at Konya. Think about that for a second. The loyal servant had suddenly become a literal existential threat. Ibrahim had opened up a road going straight to Constantinople. The situation was so incredibly desperate that the Sultan did the unthinkable. He literally begged his greatest enemy, the Russian bear, to send troops to protect his capital. After a brief, uneasy truce, war broke out again in 1839. Ibrahim decisively crushed the Ottomans at Nazib, and then the entire Ottoman naval fleet just sailed over to Alexandria and defected. A provincial governor practically had a 600-year-old empire at his absolute mercy. Finally, Phase 5, the 1840 Treaty of London, the European intervention. To prevent a chaotic scramble for Ottoman territory that honestly could have triggered a world war, Europe stepped in to clip his wings. The 1840 Treaty of London forced some massive concessions. Ali lost his hard-won Syrian empire, he had to drastically reduce his military, and he had to return that defected fleet. But in exchange for backing down, he secured the Holy Grail. He got hereditary rule over Egypt, ensuring he and his family could no longer be arbitrarily fired by the Sultan. Those terms were officially cemented a year later in 1841. Muhammad Ali basically had to accept that his grand dream of dominating and reviving the Ottoman Empire from the inside, it was over. But in being contained by Europe, something really incredible happened. Egypt was no longer just an interchangeable province on some imperial map. His actions had effectively forced it to become a distinct, legally recognized geopolitical state. Which leaves us with this really fascinating paradox to wrap up on. Muhammad Ali set out to build a machine capable of dominating the entire Islamic world, but he was ultimately boxed in by a unified Europe. Yet, when you look at the map today, while his massive military ambitions were eventually contained, didn't his relentless geopolitical maneuvering ultimately succeed in carving out the foundations of modern Egypt? Sometimes, it seems, you really can win by losing.
Welcome back, everyone. We have finally made it. Today is a pivotal moment because this is the grand finale of our 5-part explainer series, where we've been diving deep into the life, the mind, and the truly monumental era of Muhammad Ali Pasha. Now, over the last 4 parts, we've unpacked the huge military campaigns, the massive economic overhauls, and some pretty intense geopolitical chess matches. But today we're stripping all of that back. We're looking at the man behind the monument. We're talking about the architect who literally dragged a nation from centuries of slumber right into the modern age. We're going to look at what it actually cost to build a state from the ground up, and maybe most surprisingly, the intense, deeply painful anxiety he felt about passing the torch.
Okay, let's dive right into this. Look at this incredibly revealing quote from the source text. At the end of his life, when he was reflecting on his whole journey, Muhammad Ali didn't boast about his conquests. Instead, he framed his entire existence around the sacrifice of his own peace for the sake of the nation. He says, "Destroying my own rest is easy for me in the path of reforming and building the homeland." You know, this isn't just a ruler speaking here. This is an architect who is utterly obsessed with his blueprint. He viewed his relentless, restless drive as an absolute prerequisite for his nation to survive.
Section 1. End of Chaos and State Building. To truly grasp the weight of that sacrifice, we need to look at the macro-level foundation he laid down and how he completely transformed the concept of the Egyptian state. Our insights today are grounded directly in Shafiq Gorbal's definitive historical work, which was published by the Hindawi Foundation. And this text is so crucial because it doesn't just give us a dry list of dates and battles. It actually chronicles the intricate and sometimes brutal origins of the modern institutional state. It really gives us the empirical lens we need to see how Muhammad Ali actually operated on a day-to-day basis.
And when we look through that empirical lens, the before and after of Egypt under his rule is just staggering. It's like night and day. Before him, the region was essentially a fractured landscape ruled by armed Mamluk militias. We're talking fragmented resources, overlapping authorities, and just continuous draining chaos. It was a society where public welfare was constantly sacrificed for whatever a warring faction wanted that day. But after him, boom, you have a disciplined national army, a fiercely centralized state apparatus, and unified national goals. He permanently destroyed the era of armed gangs and replaced them with a cohesive, institutional monolith.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how he conceptualized this new state. Because he didn't just import a European model and lazily paste it over an Eastern society. No, the source text emphasizes that he merged modern, worldly administrative functions with foundational Islamic values of unity, cooperation, and collective duty. He strongly believed that adopting the mechanics of modern progress, things like structured taxation, massive public works, military organization, was completely in harmony with his religious duties to protect and elevate the community. He literally synthesized the ancient with the cutting edge.
Section 2. The cost of modernization. But as we all know, a transformation of this magnitude doesn't just happen organically, and it definitely doesn't happen peacefully. We have to look at the strict methodologies used to awaken the nation.
So every massive state-building goal came with a very stark historical reality. To achieve the revival of dead lands and build enormous public works like canals and barrages, the state heavily restricted individual property rights and utilized forced labor. To end the era of roaming armed gangs and actually secure the borders, the state enforced strict national obedience and claimed an absolute monopoly on violence. Now, as people analyzing history, we aren't looking at this to endorse or condemn it, right? We're looking at it to understand the sheer raw force that was required to forge a unified state out of a totally fractured system. The centralization of power was absolute.
In Muhammad Ali's eyes, these were just the non-negotiable costs of survival. He awakened the nation from centuries of slumber, and doing that meant he had to direct all individual efforts toward collective goals. He took the burden of defense away from localized tribes and threw it onto a unified, conscripted army. Ultimately, he prioritized macro-level public welfare, basically the survival and modernization of the state, over uninhibited personal freedom. He fundamentally believed that without a strong, unified state, the nation would just be devoured by outside empires.
Section 3. Forming the ruling elite. Because a centralized state cannot be run by one man alone, no matter how restless he is, he needed the right people to operate his machine.
So the crucial point is that Muhammad Ali didn't rely on a formal, written constitution to govern. The paper itself wasn't what mattered to him. His constitution was unwritten. It was based entirely on his iron will, and it was executed by a newly formed, highly educated ruling elite. He essentially manufactured a brand new aristocracy. He sent young men over to Europe, trained them in modern sciences and administration, and bound them directly to his vision. This elite class became his living, breathing state apparatus.
And the personality of the man driving this elite was fascinatingly complex. The historical records strip away all that royal mythology to reveal a deeply action-oriented, super pragmatic human being. He absolutely detested superficiality. He didn't care at all for empty titles or the pomp of old royal courts. His focus was relentlessly on tangible national reform. And, surprisingly enough, people who knew him noted he was naturally cheerful, quick to smile, yet entirely open about his one big defining flaw, his deep, burning impatience. He felt the clock ticking on his life's work every single day.
Section 4. Harsh advice for the heirs. This brings us to the most intimate and honestly probably the most stressful part of his life, the succession. We get this incredible micro-macro zoom in his later years. On one hand, he's managing the sprawling resources of an entire nation, negotiating with European empires, and building massive fleets. But on the other hand, he's up late at night writing furious, deeply anxious letters to his sons and grandsons. He was terrified, literally terrified, that the heirs to his empire lacked the discipline and the vision to keep it all together. The contrast between this grand, macro-level ruler and this micromanaging, intensely worried patriarch is just extraordinary.
And this brilliantly illustrates exactly what I mean. This is a direct reprimand aimed at his grandson Abbas after Abbas reportedly acted cruelly by killing a baker. Muhammad Ali was absolutely livid. He wrote, "If these are his actions in his youth, how can he inherit the throne? He must erase this flaw, or it will be a disaster for his old age." You see, he wasn't just scolding a misbehaving kid. He was foreseeing the potential collapse of his entire state if it fell into the hands of someone who couldn't govern with justice and restraint.
We see a similar, though maybe slightly more constructive, sternness with his son, Saeed. He commands him, "It is absolutely necessary for you to associate with those who know the new principles, so it is not said that Muhammad Ali's character is bad." So he's explicitly telling his son to rely on the educated elite, the experts in modern statecraft. But notice how deeply personal that framing is. He literally ties the success of his heirs directly to his own historical reputation. He knew how fragile his legacy really was.
Section 5. Muhammad Ali's Final Legacy. As we bring this 5-part exploration to a close, we need to synthesize all of this. What is the final tally?
Let's move to and see how this builds. 3 million. Towards the end of his life, he spoke of his ultimate motivation being the welfare and elevation of 3 million souls in his homeland. Just think about that. That was the staggering weight he placed squarely on his own shoulders. He single-handedly sought to drag 3 million people into a new era, utilizing every single resource, every drop of sweat, and every ounce of his unyielding will to make it happen.
He started out as an ambitious military commander and ended up exceeding his own wildest dreams. Muhammad Ali Pasha left behind an enduring, incredibly heavy legacy. He was the vital bridge between a fragmented ancient system and a unified modern institutional state. He laid the tracks that the nation would run on for generations to come, creating a new reality that simply could not be undone, no matter who sat on the throne after him.
So he built the machine, he trained the elite, and he issued those harsh warnings to his heirs. But history is never static, is it? As you reflect on the sheer scale of what Muhammad Ali Pasha achieved, the ultimate question remains. When the architect finally rested, did his descendants possess the strength to preserve his monumental legacy, or did the true vision of the new state slowly die with the man who dreamed it? Thank you so much for joining me on this incredible journey through history. Keep exploring, keep questioning, and I will see you in our next explainer.